Good evening. I'm Bob Gross, a member of the trustees of the Concord Museum, and I'm here to get this program off with introductions. And there's a very personal reason beyond my connection to the museum why I've been asked to do this. And that's my tie to today's speaker. It was some 3 weeks ago that John Sweet introduced me as speaker at the Concord Free Public Library. Now it's my pleasure and honor to do him the same service. Turnabout is fair play. I hope to live up to the standard he set. Back in July 1985, I presented a paper at the annual gathering of the Thoreau Society here in Concord. And following the session, 2 eager undergraduates came up to talk with me. We're going to be in your upcoming American Studies course on New England at Amherst College, they happily informed me. One was Maria Farland, now a professor of English at Fordham University. The other, her good friend, John Wood Sweet. Both were rising sophomores in the Amherst class of 1988, and I was lucky enough to become their academic advisor. Maria grew up in Lexington, John here in Concord, and nonetheless they got along. He graduated from Concord Carlisle High School, and during his time in high school, worked as a page at the Concord Free Public Library. I don't know if John saw himself as a future professor of history at that time, but it was clear from early on that he was destined to become an academic star. Rummaging among my old files, I found today a couple of his papers.
Oh, God.
For that long ago course on New England, with my comments attached to them. Actually, I'm tempted to say, do you remember them? You probably remember them as...
I will just say Bob wrote the best comments on papers of anybody I've ever known. And every time I write a student comment, I think, if I were Bob, I would spend like another hour on this.
If anybody wants to know why it took so long to write The Transcendentalist in the World, blame him. So,
You'd write like a 3-page paper, and then there'd be like 2 single-spaced pages of comments.
well, I took every word seriously. Well, here's one of them. Once again, I wrote an excellent essay. I have no idea, because I don't have a copy of the previous comments, why once again. But once again, an excellent essay, written with lucidity and argued with force. I remarked about one piece, in which I noted that John had revealed himself to be a 20th century romantic heir of Emerson. His final paper for the term, I said, was a powerful, persuasive synthesis of the course readings and discussions, presented in rich and immensely suggestive prose, and displaying a remarkable mastery of the historical issues and of the sources. Based on his performance in that course, and in his second one on culture and community, the worlds of Emily Dickinson, Emerson, and Thoreau, in which he collaborated with another student on the history of Amherst Congregational Meeting House, I was thrilled when John asked to pursue his senior honors thesis under my guidance, and chose to study the split between Concord's Unitarian and Trinitarian churches, a project close to my heart. John ran with the inquiry, did an astonishing amount of research into the membership and practices of the 2 congregations, and he produced a compelling account that received the distinction of summa cum laude and was adapted for publication in an article in the Proceedings of the Massachusetts Historical Society. His work would easily have earned an MA in any major graduate program. John went on from Amherst to Princeton, where he received a PhD in history, working with the legendary mentor John Murrin in the early American field, and writing a dissertation that took his long-standing interest in New England in a new direction by exploring the racial history of the region through the interactions of native English and African peoples. The project culminated in his first book, Bodies Politic, Negotiating Race in the American North, 1730 to 1830, which was published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2003. Bodies Politic views New England through a revealing lens, recasting the region's history as a narrative of what he calls inclusion, exclusion, and hierarchy, with settlers, native peoples, and slaves contending for liberty and power in a society that was multicultural and divided from its very start. The book set forth a series of micro-studies, intensely researched and done through a whole series of court records and sources that no one had looked at before. And they revealed how the dynamics of the social order were played out in the concrete texture of personal experience, of an approach that runs through his new book. That perspective is characteristic of John's work, as are his deep dives into the archives. Bodies Politic uncovered an oral history of the Narragansett sachemship, and the only diary known to have been kept by a colonial slave. With good reason, the book was a finalist for the Frederick Douglass Prize and earned recognition for John as a top young historian by the History News Network in 2007. I still remember a morning getting up, reading the emails that come in, and that was a subscription. And the first thing I read was, John Wood Sweet is a top historian of 2007.
Top young historian. Young historian.
Since 2003, John has been a professor in the Department of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and has served as director of the university's program in sexuality studies. Over that time, he has co-edited 2 volumes of essays on the Atlantic world of the 17th and 18th centuries, and has been working on a biography of Venture Smith, a native of West Africa, who as a child was kidnapped and sold into slavery, transported across the Atlantic, and obliged to forge a new life as a bondsman on farms along Long Island Sound, from which he managed by dint of strenuous labor and steadfast purpose to acquire freedom for himself and his family, and to make a place as a farmer and householder in East Haddam, Connecticut. Smith also published a narrative of these experiences, the earliest in America by a native of Africa. That project is now at the top of his agenda. But that study was interrupted by a discovery he made in the course of his teaching women's history and sexuality studies. And that was an account of the criminal trial of the gentleman Harry Bedloe for the rape of working girl Lana Sawyer in New York City in 1793. The record of that case is the first published report of an American rape trial in the United States. And John quickly perceived its potential for revealing the sexual double standards of the day, that made women vulnerable to exploitation and abuse, and it was its potential for exposing the patriarchal premises that made justice for the victims almost impossible to achieve, and for exposing the class biases that distorted the law in favor of the privileged and made dreams of romantic love felt by young people in the 1790s a handy means for the rich and well-born to get their way. John has turned the episode into a compelling case study with resonances of his undergraduate papers so many years ago. Now, professors often like to claim credit for the achievements of their students. So let me suggest not influence on his work, but simply an affinity with it. To place Lana Sawyer in her historical setting, John created one database after another, a GIS database of houses, owners, and residents key to contemporary maps in Lower Manhattan, another of criminal prosecutions for sexual assault in New York City during the era, and a counterpart record of seduction suits. And fourth, a database of branch pilots who worked in the New York harbor in order to make and he did that in order to make sense of the occupation and social status of Lana Sawyer's stepfather. All these forays into the archives undergird the analysis, but do not intrude into the narrative. And I think that's just kind of wonderful. Just all this research, and then doesn't make you have to wade through it. Tells you the results in a compelling narrative.
All of that, Bob, I just copied from Minutemen and Their World.
all these forays into the archives undergird the scholarship but don't intrude into the narrative. John moves easily between the micro and the macro. For this is a book that puts people at the center and reconstructs their relationships with one another. Through the woman at the focus of the narrative, though the woman at the focus of the narrative is little known, you will be astonished at how many prominent figures are connected to the contending parties, including Aaron Burr, the novelist Susanna Rosen, and Alexander Hamilton as the perpetrator's lawyer in a role that Lin-Manuel Miranda never conceived. Even the brothel keeper Mother Carey emerges from the shadows and stereotypes to become an actor in her own right. The leading figure is, of course, Lana Sawyer, the sewing girl, whose skill with needle and thread serves her well in defense of her respectability. Serendipitously, the products of her labor could easily have found a place in the Concord Museum's current exhibition, Interwoven, Women's Lives Written in Thread. John tells her story in a gripping narrative that is a page-turner. And as we follow the story, we come to appreciate Lana not as a victim of a sexual assault, but as an individual who, against all odds, asserted herself, summoned up the resilience to face the male powers in family and state, and demand justice for the wrong that was done to her. In the process, John reveals himself as a historian with a remarkable moral imagination, a capacious view of social history, and the narrative skill of a first-rate novelist. John's interlocutor this evening is Claire Nelson, a member of the Board of Governors of the Concord Museum. And Claire is chair of the museum's Education and Public Programs Committee. She is also a trustee of the Massachusetts Historical Society, where she chairs the Education Committee. A graduate of Princeton, she attended graduate school at Yale from 1998 to 2003, earning an MA in political science and an MPhil in American history. She is the former Bill Bailey History Department head at Concord Academy, where for 10 years She taught courses in African American history, immigration and nativism in the United States from colonial settlement to the present, protest movements of the 1980s, oral history, and modern American conservatism. Since 2008, she's lived in Concord with her husband and 3 children. And I'll turn it over to them.
Well, thank you, John, for being here and for being willing to talk to us a little bit about your incredible book. Bob's done a really nice job of sort of setting the scene a little bit, of telling us a little bit about who the sewing girl is, what her tale is, but maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how you came to this project, how you thought about it as you kind of crafted your approach.
Yeah, so The Sewing Girl's Tale tells a story that for a long time I thought I understood. And even today, 230 odd years later, it seems all too familiar. On a late summer's day in 1793, a young seamstress, 17-year-old seamstress, was walking down Broadway when she attracted the attention of a group of Frenchmen who started to catcall and harass her. She later said that she couldn't understand their language, but she knew what they were saying. At that moment, a gentleman interposed himself and drove the Frenchmen away and offered to escort her home. And he then asked her out for a walk a couple evenings later, to which she eventually kind of agreed. And he ended that encounter by introducing himself with a false name as Lawyer Smith. He gave her a false name because by age 25, he had already acquired a reputation in the city as a sexual predator, and he was trying to go under her radar. This is a period when New York City was just 40,000 people living pretty much below what is now City Hall in Lower Manhattan. So it's just the tip of the island. Everything north of City Hall pretty much was farmland. So she would have known him, she did know him by reputation, though not by sight. So a few evenings later, they went out for an evening stroll, which began innocently enough with a glass of ice cream, which was a new delicacy, and a stroll on the Battery, which was a new public amenity, just had been opened as a park. And that ended with him dragging her, kicking and screaming, into the back room of a brothel run by a woman named Mother Carey. And the next morning, Lana found herself in this back room. She took stock of herself. She realized that her gown, the dress she'd been wearing, had been torn and damaged during the assault. So she sat collecting herself mentally and sewing the gown back together before she emerged into the hallway. And in the hallway, she was greeted by the madam, whose name was Mother Carey. And Mother Carey assumed that Lana would want to shrink away in shame and silence. Then, as now, the vast majority of survivors of acquaintance rapes do not make formal complaints, either to university officials, for example, or to police departments. Some estimate that figure as high as 85% of acquaintance rapes go unreported. But as it turned out, both Henry Bedloe and Mother Carey underestimated Lana Sawyer. So Mother Carey, kind of casting Lana as a kind of a shamefaced young woman, said, "Dearie, I can show you out the back door so no one will see you, or I can check and see if there's anyone out in the street, and you can go out the front." And Lana said, "No, I will go out the front, and I don't care who sees me, even if it is my father." So Mother Carey certainly hadn't expected that flash of anger or that defiant spirit. A week later, Lana and her family filed formal charges of sexual assault against Harry Bedloe. A month later, there was a trial. The court convened at like 10 o'clock in the morning. 15 hours later, the judge read his charge to the jury. So this is 1 a.m. And the jury, after 15 hours in court, the jury spent 15 minutes deliberating. And a lot of people were surprised by the verdict, which was not guilty, because there had been a huge throng of spectators at the trial, very active and engaged during the trial. And many had felt that Lana made a very persuasive case. So I first encountered this case through the published report of the trial, which, as Bob mentioned, was the first of its kind in the United States. It was around the time that I was even younger than I was in 2005. It was around the time that Ms. Magazine had first coined the term date rape, which was 1986. And it seemed to me a particularly vivid example of the problem of acquaintance rape, and I used it that way in college classes to help students kind of understand the origins of modern rape culture. But I didn't really see anything that I had to contribute to our understanding of the case. Then about 15 years ago, a graduate student I was working with, in the course of her own research, came across a little snippet in a New York newspaper published in 1798, so 5 years after the rape trial. And it really threw me for a loop, because it suggested that there was a whole other dimension of the story that I hadn't imagined. And at the very least, what it showed was that this story went on for years longer than I had thought. I'd kind of thought that the end of the rape trial was kind of the end of the story. And in many ways, the end of the rape trial was really just the beginning of this journey. So, over time, as I got curious and started researching, this kind of turned into a book project that displaced other priorities. And it became an opportunity that I found really fascinating to explore the American Revolution, the period after the Revolution, through the eyes not of some founding father like Alexander Hamilton, although he does appear, as Bob mentioned, but rather through the eyes of an ordinary young woman, a teenager who had to sew garments for a living to help her family make ends meet. And if she hadn't reacted to this sexual assault in a really unusual way, it's very likely that she would have disappeared from the historical record without any trace at all. Even the record of her birth disappeared after the Revolution. What emerged was the story of a young woman looking to make her way in a city full of opportunity and danger, a story of working men frustrated with snobbish elites clinging to inherited privileges and political power, a story of early feminists making bold new arguments about human rights at a time when the only way a young woman could earn enough wages to support herself was by working as a prostitute. I suppose I had three thoughts, aside from just do whatever Bob would do, when I began thinking about this book. And one of them was that I was directing the University of North Carolina's program in sexuality studies, and that was a time when front of mind for a lot of us was the problem of acquaintance rape on college campuses and the challenges of providing meaningful recourse for students, but also more broadly making campuses safe for all students, which remains a challenge. And I did some work in that field and decided that the main contribution that I could probably make was historical. It also came for me as kind of an experiment in a new way of telling history. So I wrote this book consciously as a way to experiment with writing a character-driven historical narrative. And I learned that there was a lot of things I needed to learn in order to do that. I wanted to make New York City 230 years ago vivid. I wanted people to be able to imagine the city, the sights and smells and sounds of the city. And that required some different kinds of research than I'd really focused on in the past, and required learning all the special New York's ways of figuring that out. I also knew that I really wanted to find a way of telling the story that kept Lana Sawyer at the center. And this was a challenge because the historical records were largely produced by men, and they were largely written because of disputes among men. And the men kept trying to take over the sources and take over the story. But I wanted to make it very clear that this was an event that didn't define Lana Sawyer. It certainly was important to her life, that she had a childhood and a whole backstory before this that helped explain her character and her motivations and her sense of what was possible. And I wanted to make it clear that she had a long future after this incident. I think she emerged from this experience traumatized and clearly damaged, but also resilient. And so I wanted to be able to tell enough of her after story to show that she had moved on and fashioned a new life for herself. So those are some things I was focused on.
I mean, I would just say that, as a historian, read a lot of history, I think one of the things that is so amazing about this book is the way in which you kind of bring together all these competing levels of narratives, within the story. Mm-hmm. That, the Sewing Girl's Tale balances these kind of personal and intensely sort of specific details of Lana Sawyer's life and experience with these kind of larger currents of, British, French, American geopolitical and, international power struggles. You're telling the story of kind of working class men and women who are mobilizing these rhetorics of equality and class grievance at the same time as you're weaving in characters like Mary Wollstonecraft and Alexander Hamilton. And then there's also, of course, kind of the backdrop of this municipal transformation of New York City, the sort of evolution and creation of these new jurisprudential precedents. And I think one of the really, amazing ways in which you kind of pull all this together is specifically by keeping Lana Sawyer at the sort of center of the story and kind of allowing her experiences to then, create that orbit in which you are allowed to then, evolve and elaborate on this whole world. Going from kind of the huge to the sort of very, very specific. I have to ask in part because the idea of using objects to illuminate the past is so central to the mission of the Concord Museum. Uh-huh. And as Bob referenced, we've got this fabulous exhibit, Interwoven, Women's Lives Written in Thread, going on right now. You've talked a little bit about the ways in which your research for this book took you on some deep dives into material culture and into the histories of textiles and fashion. Mm-hmm. And in fact, your epilogue uses a Sewing Girl's sampler to really shift, or what I see is really shifting the direction of the story, right? And bringing it to potentially a more hopeful conclusion, right? That the Sewing Girl's Tale might otherwise have had a pretty unsettling ending. I mean, mm-hmm. Spoiler alerts, her stepfather wins this landmark case that is really more about male prerogative than it is about women's rights. Alexander Hamilton gets the Lin-Manuel Miranda treatment. We get 220 years of kind of...
You get the anti-Lin-Manuel Miranda treatment.
No, I mean, not in your... I'm talking about sort of the 220 years, yes. Since 1793. We get 220 years of rape culture that sort of, yields statistics like the fact that fewer than 15% of acquaintance rapes and assaults are ever reported to the police. We get Clarence Thomas and Brett Kavanaugh and Samuel Alito. So there are a lot of reasons why this book might have concluded on an uneasy note. But in using the sampler in your epilogue, I see anyway, that you're highlighting these themes of resilience instead. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about what it was about these objects of material culture that are at the heart of the story, right? The work, the fabric, the skill, that so drew you in, and what you learned and kind of gained from doing this kind of research.
Mm-hmm. All right, there's a lot in that question. Because I thought we were going in the direction of storytelling and narrativity, and
We can go in any
I have a
direction
whole
you
thought
want.
there. But let's talk about samplers for a minute, because the Concord Museum has this incredible exhibit of its sampler collection. And I was very happy to see that one of them, so there's a
You
very
haven't seen
distinctive
that.
sampler that I used as an illustration in the book. It's from the collections at Winterthur. It's a mending sampler that happens to be done in red, white, and blue colors. So I thought I latched onto that example. But one of the samplers on exhibit here seems like it may well have been done in Susanna Roson's school for young women in Boston. And she's an important novelist whose work is important for the book, and who I also have a little hallucinatory speculation that she may play another role in the book as well. So she's a figure right after my heart. I'll just say, I have a whole shtick about the gown, and I would love to talk about the gown. The sampler from...
Please do.
But to avoid turning this into a giant monologue, I'll just say that the mending sampler for me, I had this challenge at the end of the book where I didn't know exactly what the end of Lana Sawyer's story was. And so I had to find a way. So I chose the mending sampler as kind of a metaphoric way of thinking about Lana Sawyer in the aftermath of this assault and rebuilding her life. And the point of a mending sampler is like the instructor, the sewing teacher at the school, takes a perfectly good piece of linen and cuts a bunch of holes in it. And then the kids are told to sew in the gaps in the style of a variety of different, more or less complex fabrics. And so the challenge is both reproducing a woven textile with a needle and thread, so using a different technology to produce the texture and the pattern of a fabric, but also you've got to keep the fabric's tension consistent, so you don't end up with a wrinkly or lumpy patch. So I tried for like 5 minutes to do my own mending sampler and gave up. I was like, yeah, that's way beyond me. But for me, it's a symbol of that I think it's important. I was thinking of this, I was rereading a piece by Peril Siegel in New York Times about the forced heroism of sexual assault survivors, in which she was saying, like, it's not right just to imagine that all sexual assault survivors are heroic and that everybody should be reporting and everything ends great, because there's a lot of damage that accumulates, which is not to say that the damage defines all aspects of your life going forward, but that we should be taking the damage seriously too. And so so for me, the mending sample was an example of damage that is then repaired. The damage isn't healed. It doesn't just grow over. I've got a baby. Like, you scratch his face in the morning, not deliberately. And by evening, it's perfect. That's not what happens in a sexual assault. But you rebuild a life for yourself in a way that incorporates the threads that have broken or been frayed or been cut. And it's different.
And tell us about the dress. And your sort of investigation into the dress.
So the dress is a good example of like how clueless my research process could often be. So one of the remarkable things about this trial is that there was actually a piece of forensic evidence introduced in trial. And it was the gown Lana had been wearing, which got torn and then which she had repaired. and it was exhibited in court, I think mainly for evidence about its having been torn. And it's described in a couple different places in the report of the trial as a calico gown with a drawn frill about the neck. It's said that it was held together by pins, which were then popped out during the assault, and it was held together also by a number of strings that were then broken during the assault. And I thought, well, that's awesome, because I can kind of figure out what the gown looked like. So I went into this whole thing of trying to think like, well, what was Lana wearing, and what does that tell us, and what would the gown look like? And so I was very focused on the aesthetic, the appearance of the gown, and I did all this research and found that it's very hard to tell what a calico gown with a drawn frill about the neck looked like in 1793, because it was a period of transition in women's fashion. And if this had been 1780, it would have been pretty obvious. And if it had been 1800, it would have been pretty obvious. But in 1793, it could have been a lot of different things. So I was then stuck with like different realms of probability or plausibility. So I started consulting experts, including the big expert in colonial revolutionary period American clothing, Linda Baumgarten, who was the head textile research curator at Colonial Williamsburg. And I went to visit her, and she very graciously sat me down in her office and made time for me and was very patient. And she read the excerpts that I had, descriptions, little references to the gown. And she's like, well, 3 strings. 3 strings is hard to explain. The pins are easy to explain. 3 strings. So she went through different possibilities and drew some sketches, and she told me probably it was a round gown, probably it had a bodice that was tightly fitted and then held together with straight pins down to the waist, and then the waist was secured with drawstrings, because there would have been a drop panel on the front of the gown so you could get in and out of it. These gowns always had a very tight waist, so you had to be able to release the waist in order to get into it. In any case, I was like, oh, all right. And then she says, it was probably a round gown, and it may well have looked like one of these. And I was like, all right, mission accomplished, I'm done. And I was all getting ready to pack myself up and leave. And she said, but that's not what's interesting about the gown. And I said, oh, I think I'm about to get schooled. And she said, well, actually, there's 2 things that are really interesting about the gown. One is the fact that Bedloe wanted it off, because people didn't wear underwear in the 18th century. So she wasn't wearing bloomers or anything like that. She just had a shift on underneath, open. Everything she was wearing would have been open. And Bedloe would have had breeches or trousers on. But again, he wouldn't have been wearing underwear, except for a long shirt tails. So she said, the first thing is that tells you something about Henry Bedloe's sexual aim, that he didn't want to just pull up her skirts and have sex with her. He wanted her naked. He wanted her exposed. He wanted whatever that meant to him. He wanted that as part of the scene. And to me, it evokes a kind of domination, a kind of vulnerability on her part, a kind of exposure. But in any case, it tells you something about his intent. And then she said, the fact that the gown is damaged tells you this was a violent encounter. And I said, I'm paying attention. And she said, yeah, because there's no way that Lana would have damaged her own gown taking it off. We think of the modern romance novel as a bodice ripper, because the woman character is supposed to rip off her bodice in a fit of passion. Are you with me? But we're talking about fast fashion, where you buy something at TJ Maxx for $10 and you can rip it apart and move on with your life. But in the 18th century, Linda was saying, nobody would do that. Lana was not rich, and textiles were expensive. So if she wanted to get her gown off, she would have dismantled the gown the way it needed to be. So the fact that it was taken off and damaged in the process means that somebody else was taking it off, and they were doing so against her will and in a violent way. Which means that the reason it was introduced in trial was actually valid. That it was introduced in trial to show that the assault had been violent. It was in fact the forensic evidence of the violence of the assault. And I was like, oh. Well, I was glad I stuck around for the, that's not what's interesting part of that conversation.
Well, which then also goes to kind of why you would have expected the jurors, you know, the people in the courtroom sort of presented with this evidence would have seen it as and understood it as a violent attack, and why they might have been so surprised by the jurors' verdict when it comes back.
Yeah, although you can also understand why the jurors, who are affluent men who didn't, you know, fix their own clothes, may have been clueless to that whole level of argumentation. But it definitely shows the importance of historical museums with object collections and expert curators who have a deep understanding of the objects.
One more question. We can open it up to the audience. So you've talked a little bit about the way in which kind of Lana Sawyer's story reveals that 1793 is this kind of moment in which our modern rape culture is being created, right? Where the legal definitions of rape are narrowed, and you suggest that this is in part because the judge in the case leveraged Matthew Hale's incredibly misogynistic jurisprudential interpretations as kind of legal precedent, which of course makes me wonder what might have been if only he'd been reading another jurist. I know that a lot of historians kind of hate counterfactuals, but I'm really curious about the historical contingency that is sort of at the heart of this story. Is it just wishful thinking on my part, or are there cases or countries in this era where judges and juries might have gone a different way?
This is me wriggling. I think we as historians, we know broadly that there was a major shift in the law of sexual assault, law of rape, in the late 18th and in the early 19th centuries, which involved, as Claire mentioned, a kind of narrowing of the practical definition of rape as a violent assault by a stranger rather than a coerced encounter with an acquaintance. So it kind of splits stranger rape and acquaintance rape as kind of separate matters in law, as they pretty much are now. It's a very different prospect to prosecute a stranger assault than an acquaintance assault today. So we kind of know that happened, and I'm not sure this case would have changed that wave of historical change in itself. But there are two things I would say. One is that this case shows how that happened. We see the way lawyers were deploying not only old commentators like Sir Matthew Hale, who was writing in the 1670s, so they were not only ratifying and lionizing his commentaries as though they should be the standard for defining sexual assault. Hale was deeply suspicious of rape claims, particularly acquaintance rape claims, because he believed that poor women were prone to make up sexual assaults in order to harass and blackmail rich men like himself. So there's that. But for me, what's most audacious about the lawyers arguing in this case is not that they tried to validate Hale's commentaries or Blackstone's commentaries on the law, which were not the law themselves. They were just commentaries on the law. They were like op-eds on the law. But the lawyers for the defense in this case, there was a team of 6 of the best attorneys in the country defending Harry Bedloe. But they just kept making things up. So what's remarkable about the judge is that he didn't say, when they said Hale said this, they were lying. When they said Hale said this, they were lying. He just agreed with what they claimed Hale said, which was not what Hale said. So like Hale said, you should report the case while it's recent, and if the woman reports the assault while it's recent, she's more likely to be telling the truth. The defense in this case said she's required to report the case immediately, or it is not valid as a matter of law. That's baloney. They just invented that. So that's what's most remarkable about this case, is the way they rewrote what even these famously misogynistic legal commentators had said 150 years earlier.
Well, and he's got whatever it is, 5 criteria, right? And she actually meets all 5 of them, except for the ways in which the lawyers then spin it.
Yeah. So her stepfather took her to a private attorney before they lodged an official complaint, and the private attorney consulted. I'm very confident consulted a copy of Blackstone, which was a more 1760s update of English commentaries, which incorporated a lot of Hale's commentaries. Are you with me? It's a little complicated. I mentioned Blackstone because I bought his copy of Blackstone. So the copy that he was consulting while Lana was in the room, I actually bought on like eBay. And it did not have marginalia that was useful, so sadly. But the point is that, you could go through her case and listen to her story and say, yeah, he listed these at least four criteria, and she checks all the boxes. She passes all these tests. She meets the standards written by this crazy judge as a credible accusation, which is why the defense in this case invented a whole new set of standards, which they claimed. So the best one is. I'm trying to be quick. Hale said, a rape claim is more likely to be valid if the woman is, quote, of good fame. And good fame means you have a good reputation. So the defense said, well, she obviously has a good reputation, but that really shouldn't be the question. The question should be, what is her inner character? And who's to say that even though she pretends to have a good facade to the world, that she isn't actually corrupt, that she isn't actually full of dark desires. Dark desires was one of their words. So they spent hours speculating about how depraved she could potentially be in her inner character. Are you with me? Which you can't produce evidence about because there's no way of producing evidence. So they just speculated about how corrupt she could be. And they tried to make it seem like she's been pulling the wool over their eyes by acting virtuous while actually being a slut. Without any evidence. So that's an example where there's a real audacity to the lawyer's arguments in this case, where they did just replace concept and words and then act as though they didn't do it.
And that's before we even get to Alexander Hamilton.
And that's before we get to Alexander Hamilton.
We should open the floor up to
Yes, of course.
questions from the audience. I'm sure there will be.
Well, I just have a comment. It strikes me that rather than him being on trial, she's on trial. Her character, as you're referencing, and right. So this is just almost another story similar to what we hear today, only it dates back to an earlier time. And what's interesting is if so many people relied on, was it Hale's perspective, and just using that as a starting ground to spin it. And again, make her look as if she's out for something in a conniving way.
Yeah, the
It's-
philosopher Kate Mann has described an aspect of this phenomenon as she was trying to think about why it is that in rape trials, acquaintance rape trials especially, sympathy tends to devolve on the defendant rather than on the victim. And she calls this dynamic himpathy. And I think she's right that that's a really basic problem. It's a big cultural, ideological problem that's beyond the literal law of rape, which has to do with so at some level I think the rape trial in Lana Sawyer's case is not a case so much about who we believe. It's a question of who do the jurors care about? Who do they think matter? And the defense spent a lot of time trying to say, Lana's not somebody who matters. She's not somebody you have to worry about. But this gentleman is somebody you should worry about. And I think part of it, I think, is a basic challenge to criminal trials, but so I'll say this and then I'll take it back, that in a rape trial, the damage to the woman has already, or the victim, has already been done. And the rape trial turns into a contest over whether the perpetrator is going to be held accountable and face consequences. So it comes into a question of whether he's going to lose his job or be able to finish out his career as a varsity swimmer or keep control of his corporation or get his seat on a court or whatever. So it's about the potential damage to him rather than the damage that has already happened to the victim. So I think that's an inherent aspect of the way criminal jurisprudence works in this kind of case. On the other hand, you don't really see that in other kinds of criminal cases. For example, people sometimes think it was because rape was a death penalty case that people were hesitant to convict Bedloe. But the case before it took less than an hour and was about a series of forgers who were actually accused of forging deeds using the name of one of the defense attorneys. So it was a very small world. Anyway, they were all convicted within an hour and sentenced to death and executed within 2 weeks. So it's not like this was a culture that refused to execute people.
I have a question because I'm a little bit confused. You were mentioning how he changed his name because he had a bad reputation and the city of New York was quite small. How come that didn't come up in the trial? Because if they were attacking... It did, but they ignored the fact that he clearly had a reputation?
Did not ignore it. The defense said, what were you thinking going out with Henry Bedloe? And the prosecution said, he lied. And they said, well, you should have known. Clearly you should have known. What could you have imagined that a gentleman like him wanted with a working girl like you? That literally was a man who lived, the attorney who lived 2 doors down from her said, what does a mere sewing girl imagine a gentleman like him would have been after? So they used that against her. They're skillful attorneys. They used his bad reputation in his favor by saying anyone who would have agreed to go out with him must have pre-consented to having sex. And they used her misperception of his identity against her by saying she was reckless and imprudent and shouldn't have gone out with somebody she couldn't trust.
And also managed to use her good reputation in his favor
Yes.
as well.
One thing we didn't really cover so far is after the trial, the community response was really interesting to me.
Amazing.
Yeah, and so the people outside were hearing apparently the case, but responded entirely differently to how the courtroom judgment went, right?
So the case was followed by a series of riots. First by a series of riots in which hundreds of men gathered in the evening about a week after the trial and first attacked the brothel in which the assault took place, and then a series of other brothels over the course of the next couple nights. And They're classic 18th century riots like the Boston Tea Party. They focus not on violence against people, but against symbolic property, in this case the buildings of the brothels, which they demolish systematically and destroy all the furniture, leaving like piles of kindling and bed feathers. And then there's a big newspaper controversy, which begins with a fight over the riots themselves and whether the riots were a legitimate response, in which the mayor and the city fathers are saying, oh, you bad hooligans, you should not be rioting in the city and depriving people of their property rights. And the rioters write back saying like, oh, really? Why is it you're so afraid of being inconvenienced by not having brothels to go to? If you people were doing your jobs, we wouldn't have these brothels as a public nuisance in the city. Maybe you should work on doing your jobs and we won't have to do your job for you. Which then escalated into a big, much broader debate up and down the East Coast. So I do think like that's an extraordinary response to a trial. I've never seen another trial in early America that resulted in riots, much less a series of riots and a big newspaper controversy.
It struck me because it was about the time after the George Floyd, public response was much different.
Well, yes. And it's also a difference in the style of rioting, where the 18th century style of riot was very carefully calibrated to avoid any impression of violence against people or self-interested looting. But that shift happened in the 19th century. But this was still an 18th century style of riot that made it easier for the rioters to claim the moral high ground.
I think we're unfortunately out of time, but I believe we stay and sign.
I'm here.
Are you
I'm
signing
happy
books?
to sign
Are
books.
you?
I'm happy to talk.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so
Don.
much.
Really lovely.
Okay, thank you.